so relentless, I am won. Oh, by perfect love, wrapped within the arms of heaven, in a peace that lasts forever, sinking deep in mercy. See, I'm wide awake, drawing closer by grace, and all my heart is yours. All fear removed, I breathe you in, I lean into your love. Oh, your love. When I'm lost, you pursue me. Lift my head to see your glory, Lord of all. So beautiful. Here in you, I find shelter, captivated by the splendor of your face. Oh, my secret place, I'm wide awake, drawing closer by grace, and all my heart is yours. All fear removed, I breathe you in, I lean into your love. Oh, your love.
I don't like it when you like. I don't like
Your love so deep is washing over me. Your face is all I seek. You are my everything. Jesus Christ, you are my one desire. Lord, hear my only cry, to know you all my life. Love so deep is.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Friday Night Vespers. I have some announcements, and they should be on the screen. Never mind. Okay. There's a hangout at the Im's house tomorrow from 3 to 8. And there's also live wire after church. Meet in the youth chapel. And that's it. Okay. Thank you.
Happy Sabbath, everybody. Please join with us as we sing our opening song, What a Beautiful Name. You were the Word at the beginning, one with God, the Lord Most High. Your hidden glory in creation, now revealed in you are Christ. What a beautiful name it is. What a beautiful name it is. The name of Jesus Christ, my please rise and sing with us as we sing our opening song, Another in the Fire.
I know that's where you'll be. Count the joy come every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be. You may be seated.
All right, happy Sabbath, everyone. I love how it's all the youth on the left side and parents on the right side. Very interesting. At this time, we're going to separate into different groups. So all the youth and any children and kids can head to the youth chapel together. We'll have a separate program for us. And this time, we'll have a parent seminar given to us by Dr. Ruth Chung. And Pastor Richard, if you could come to the front, he'll be introducing our speaker. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. We're gonna have to move our seats a little bit because this whole place is now empty. Okay, and the average age is going up like very quickly right now. I'm gonna ask all these young people over here, my favorite people, to move this way and sit right here for us, please. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay, everyone, we all know why we're here, right? We're just making sure that we do not mess up our children. So we all need to hear this, okay? Dr. Ruth Chung is a psychology professor at USC. She's been there for a long time. And she's been doing a lot of parenting seminars and relationship seminars for Korean American Seventh-day Adventists for a long time, and we're very, very blessed that she's here. Let's give her a hand, everyone.
To put something, okay? There, I think we're on. Okay. Well, thank you for coming out on a Friday evening. Thank you. It is always an honor for me to minister to the people of God. My day job is a professor at USC. I have been teaching there for 25 years. I direct the marriage and family therapy program. My academic pedigree is a graduate of PUC. In the psychology department, and then I did a student missionary work in Korea for a year, and then I did my graduate work, both my master's and PhD in counseling psychology from UC Santa Barbara. I am married to a fellow academic. He's a history professor and a vice provost at UCLA. So we have some interesting family rivalry at home, especially since we have two boys. And currently, we live on the campus of USC. I'm what's called a faculty. My day job is as a professor, but my calling is really to minister to the people of God. And as I was preparing for my doctoral exams, walking up and down the beaches of Santa Barbara, I was praying and preparing and dedicating myself. And the text that really defines my sense of calling is really Isaiah 40, which reads, comfort ye, my people." And so, as I said, it is truly an honor and a blessing for me to be here with you. So here, I'm able to actually combine biblical principles, but with a very large body of research on what are some of the practices? What are effective parenting practices? So what I hope that you will do is a couple of things. One is just sit back and listen. So I've already sent to Pastor Richard both the PowerPoint as well as handout with a summary of the tips. So he will share that with you afterwards. So you don't have to take notes. It's best if you just kind of sit and absorb. I'm going to be talking about basic principles, but it is up to you to to translate those principles and apply them to your particular situation, because it's very difficult to address every single unique and particular situation. So what I typically do is talk about basic principles and then really allow you to apply them to your particular context. The other thing that I want to mention is that there's nothing more guilt-inducing than parenting, especially for mothers. I remember when my first child was born, and if he got a cold, my father, who's a pastor who actually started the Loma Linda Korean Church many, many years ago, he would be like, "What did you do?" So if society doesn't do that to us, we impose that on ourselves. And so parenting is very much a guilt-prone profession. But the fact that you are here already affirms that you want to be good parents. You are good parents, but you want to be better parents. And it is never too late to learn. A few weeks ago, I actually did this parenting seminar at the Filipino American church just down the street. And they kept mentioning what a great church this is, and they were quite jealous and envious. It was funny, they kept mentioning that. But what was funny and interesting, and actually I've done this seminar both here in the Korean-speaking group, I've done this, as well as many other Korean and other churches. And you think that this is ideal for parents of young children, and you're the perfect demographic for it. But I share this information with grandparents and those who's my parents' age, basically, whose children are fully grown. But even for them, there's value and relevance, because in some ways, they need to come to terms with and understand the ways in which, even without realizing it, they made mistakes. And that they're still grandparents, and they still need to have some of those dialogues with their own grown children. So this content that I'm about to share with you actually has relevance across generation and age. So I'm going to pray and really invite the Holy Spirit to bless this time. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for being our amazing Heavenly Father. You overwhelm us with your love and your grace and your goodness. And you have implanted in us the desire to raise up our children to love you and to honor you and to be a blessing to this world. And so, Father, bless our time together. Bless the hearts and the desires that bring us together this evening. And may your Holy Spirit speak through me to impress upon each and every heart what it is that they need to hear. And through the gentle and quiet whisperings of the Spirit, Father, implant the seeds of knowledge and understanding to each parent, each person here, as is needed. We thank you so much again for your Son, Jesus, in whose name I pray. Amen. All right. I see myself, but not the PowerPoint. Okay, I guess I'll have to. If there's a way to put it on the back screen, that would help so I don't have to keep turning. Okay. So, as I was indicating, just to kind of frame what we already know, and that is that parents are the single most important people in the lives of most human beings. The role and the influence that parents have is really unquantifiable, typically from our own parents. But oftentimes as we grow up, it is almost half and half. When I grow up, I'm not going to be like my parents. As much as when I grow up, I'm going to be like my parents. But in order for us to think about how can we be better parents, because that's why we're here, how can we be better parents? We also need to understand how we were parented and what shapes us. Because our own experience of growing up very much shapes and influences the kind of parents that we are. So we're going to do kind of parallel double processing. On one hand, as I talk about some of the research on different kind of parenting style and the consequences of different kinds of parenting style, own experiences. But in that insight, that you would also then figure out how to apply that to your own children. Right? So as I've indicated, there's a very large body of research that has been developed in the field of developmental psychology that looks at how parents differ from each other and what are the social, emotional, academic, moral consequences of different approaches to parenting. All right. What's really amazing is that as I really researched and looked at this body of research, how the basic principles of effective parenting are actually very much in convergence with biblical principles and those that Mrs. White have talked about. And so there is an essential objectivity to truth that is really quite wonderful and amazing to see as a psychologist. And in fact, when I was starting to study psychology back way in the day when it was still frowned upon within the church as something that would lead you to lose your faith, in actuality, as I've kind of journeyed both personally and professionally, it has strengthened my faith more than anything, because I see that truth is truth. And that whether it's through scientific method or through the biblical process, that there is a certain convergence of truth, as long as my anchor is in a personal relationship with God. So turn to the person next to you, or if you're actually, let me see, you're all sitting in, so turn behind you. Okay, because I want you to, this is the fun part, just have a conversation with someone you didn't come with. And think back to your own childhood. That moment, that realization when you went maybe to a friend's house, or you had this insight that, oh, not all parents are like my parents. Remember that moment? There's a certain moment in which every child realizes, oh, not all parents are like my parents. Not all family is like my family. So talk with someone you didn't come with about in what ways do parents differ from each other in the way that they go about parenting. Okay? So just talk about your experience or insights around that. In what ways do parents differ from each other in the way that they parent? Oh, good. Oh, good. All right. I wish I could give you more time to discuss, but I know you want to get home and you have young children. So let me hear from you. Normally, I would be down there with you, but I'm told to stay up here, and I keep going closer to the edge because my natural style is to connect, but I'm told we're live streaming, so I have to stand right here. But I want this to be very interactive, so if you could share some of your discussions around the ways in which you experience your parents, or you observe parents to be different from one another. Some brave person start the conversation. Yes, I see my Yorba Linda peeps. Hi, good to see you. Oh. So kind of gender differences according to traditional gender roles, but how those are changing in the Korean American and the second generation. Okay. Other observations, insights about how parents differ from one another in the way that they go about parenting. I'd like to hear someone's early childhood experience where they realize, oh, my parents are very different from my friend's parents when I went over their house. In what way? Yes?
I was shocked when I went over to my friend's house and they were calling their parents by their names.
Oh, that would never happen in a Korean household, right? That was absolutely for a Korean or most, I think, Asian immigrant children. To hear the kids calling their parents by their first name is just utter unbelievableness. Yeah. What else? All right. Well, we'll move this along. Again, if it's a class time, I would wait until you participated, but but because of time, okay? So actually, what the research shows is that there are two underlying dimensions along which parents differ from each other. My clicker doesn't seem to be working all of a sudden. Can you just advance it for me? Because I don't know if it's run out of battery or... Okay? So, So the two underlying dimensions, once I mention it, you go, oh yeah, kids are very attuned to how strict parents are. So, the name calling is one of those, is that some parents are very strict and some parents are very easygoing. Right? So that's one of the ways in which kids notice how parents differ from one another. So that's one of the underlying dimensions that Diana Baumrind, a developmental psychologist from Stanford, developed this model back in 1971 and identified strictness, how demanding and how controlling as one of the main dimensions. So you can be high or very low. The other horizontal dimension is that of affection and warmth. So again, a lot of Asian American kids, when they go to their friends' homes, especially if it's a Caucasian family that they visit, they see how demonstrative parents are. The hugging and the warmth and the kissing. Okay? And also the fact that, they may see a B+ circled and put on a refrigerator magnet, and the Asian kid is, but actually that parent put it up there as something to be proud of, rather than something to be ashamed of, right? So there are these cultural variations, but if you cross these two underlying dimensions of parenting, you come up with 4 different types of parenting style, right? So, here they are. We have authoritarian on the top left hand. You have neglecting on the bottom. And then you have what's considered the ideal parenting type, which is on the top right-hand corner. So I'm going to quickly go through these different types of parenting, and then we're going to talk about, and actually there's actually an instrument to measure more objectively which style of parenting that you have. If I were to do this as more of a weekend retreat, we would actually distribute the survey and you'd be able to identify and then have that conversation. But if you're interested in it, I can just send that to you as well. But if you would, next slide, please. So let's start with the authoritarian parenting. This would be the traditional Asian father. Okay? They're described as being authoritarian. Why? Because they have very high demand, expectation, and control. Combined with what? Low warmth, expression, support. The aloof, authoritarian, demanding, traditional Asian father. Okay? This is what actually the Confucian ideal model within East Asian culture is, this particular type of parent. Next, please. So they're very strict, controlling. They have high expectations of their children. They don't allow much room for autonomy. They expect unquestioning obedience, not very warm or supportive, and often tends to be overly perfectionistic and critical. They can be described, so I'm using the analogy of the child being like a car, and parenting is like civil engineers, road designers. So you can see with authoritarian parenting, it's designed so that the child doesn't have much leeway or room to veer off the road. Remember when you were little or you take your kids, do they still have Autoland or Autopia in Disneyland? I remember how excited I was to be able to drive, but you realize you're not really driving because you have only this much latitude. So that would be kind of akin to what an authoritarian parent would be. So what are some of the factors that contribute to a person developing or having an authoritarian parenting style? So next slide, please. Obviously, it would be, okay. I wonder, do you have time to, if you can, it would be so much easier if I could. I think it may be a battery issue because I used it not too long ago. If not, it's okay, but I'm just thinking it would be easier if I could advance it myself. What we see with the Asian versions, because most of this is based on kind of the general American population, but the Asian version of authoritarian parenting is really one that emphasizes outcomes. So grades, or awards, or other kinds of external accomplishments is a major part of that. Great. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay. Another version of this is they never compliment the child. And maybe some of you had parents like this. The parents never really complimented you, but when they were hanging out with their friends, what would they do? Excessively brag. And you would think and say, is this the same father? Right? So sometimes you would see that kind of contradiction. They would often use comparison to motivate their child. Well, that's a very kind of an Asian American or Asian version of authoritarian. Any question is seen as a challenge to authority. Right? So even the very fact of asking the question, why, in a very strict authoritarian father would be seen as a question and challenge of their authority. So what are some of the contributing factors to authoritarian parenting style? So we have already talked about it being a cultural norm. So in the way that I'm describing it, within us living in the United States, we already feel like, oh, this is a little bit harsh and negative. But again, from within, if we were all to live within Asia in a certain context, this would be a very normal kind of parenting approach. This would be considered normative and ideal, again, especially of fathers. I think religion also plays a factor in this. So if you combine religion with culture, it really enhances and reinforces and even rewards this kind of parenting approach. And again, many of us have grown underlying personality trait. And so we have outside of parenting what we call an authoritarian personality, where they're really drawn to power and exerting authority, even if regardless of the fact that it may or may not be culturally based. Right? But I think there are other factors related to immigration that kind of promotes authoritarian parenting. And I'm going to come back to this after I talk about the next part. Okay? After I talk about a permissive parenting. So what are some of the consequences and outcomes associated with authoritarian parenting? It's kind of mixed. So if parents are super strict, how are the kids going to turn out? That's the question. How do you think they turn out? How did some of you turn out? Okay. The mix of it, right? So on one hand, they stay out of trouble. That's the good part. And for the most part, they do pretty well in school. Okay? What's the downside? What do you think are some of the negative consequences of authoritarian parenting? We'll talk about that in a minute. So it tends to go in one of two ways. One is that they can be really compliant and law-abiding and go along with that very strict program. And some people stay that way, but others, once they leave the fold of the house, they can actually go off-roading. So remember that car analogy? They just completely go off-roading. But what we see is that some of the negative consequences are that children who grow up with really authoritarian parents tend to have more poor negative self-esteem because they were constantly criticized, they were constantly held to a standard. Perfectionism was very important, performance. And so if they didn't live up to the expectations of the parent, what would happen to that child? Criticized, punished. Okay? They tend to be more on the quiet, shy side. Okay, these are generalities, not in every single case. They tend to have more stomach aches and psychosomatic issues. Why do you think? They have a lot of somatic, like kids like that, like stomach aches and other kinds of body pressure, exactly. All that stress and anxiety, it's not allowed to be expressed. It can't really be expressed out. They hold it in, and so sometimes it gets internalized into a lot of stomach aches and other vague somatic complaints. The couple of things, though, that really concern me is that they become vulnerable to abuse. I'm not just talking about, just kind of the extreme kind of abuse, but what happens with these kids is that they develop an orientation in which they are too eager to please. And so anytime they find themselves, even as adults, I see, even among some of my fellow church elders or friends or grown up, I see, oh my goodness, this person must have grown up with an authoritarian, traditional Asian Adventist father, because they may be very competent and very assertive and even aggressive in their work world, but once they find themselves into certain kind of a dynamic that kind of puts them back into that place that feels familiar to that kind of dynamic with their authoritarian traditional father, I could just literally see them mentally shift into that kind of a person. And all of a sudden, this person becomes very eager to please. And so it's very interesting how these kinds of psychological patterns that develop in childhood continue on into adulthood. So they become eager to please, and what is a child that has been raised by authoritarian parents, what are they most afraid of, and what is it that they most look to do? What's most important to them? They really want to please the authority figure. They don't want to disappoint them. So that becomes kind of the basic orientation. And that's the reason why when they find themselves, again, in kind of relational patterns where they feel familiar, they often revert to that. The other part that I've seen is with creativity. So what's interesting is that with authoritarian parents, their kids do well, but only up to a certain point. And after that, they don't do as well academically as kids that are raised by the ideal type of parenting, which is authoritative. And I saw this in action with my graduate students. So I do a lot of dissertation advising because I teach mostly graduate students and doctoral students. And so one time I had this group where I had a student from Yonsei University. She was an international student. And in this small group of students that I was advising, there was also a Caucasian woman who, if you were to see how they were, she wasn't really the brightest student in the program. And this Korean woman, she was blowing everybody away. But we got to the last part of their doctoral work in which they have to write a dissertation, which is an original research. And this is the culmination of their degree, and it's because of that, the idea really needs to come from them. This is their own original creative project. And the professor, as their dissertation advisor, my role is to mainly guide the process. Okay? So we start the dialogue by asking them, so what is it that you want to do your dissertation on? And so we begin this dialogue of what the students are interested in. So the white Caucasian student comes in and she says, oh, you know what, I've been really interested in this topic and I've written some papers on it and I thought I might look at it this way and that way. And I said, okay, this is good. Well, you need to look at this literature more. And so it was a very productive kind of conversation in which I am helping to guide that process. This Korean student, the Yonsei International student, comes in and she says, all right, professor, what do you want me to do? And I said, no, this is no longer you're in a class. This is your original dissertation project. She goes, I know, but what do you think I should do? So we spent an hour, me getting more and more frustrated, me trying to tell her that this is her project, and she keeps asking me, what is it that I think is an important topic to do? So what was so interesting in looking at these two students in the arc of their doctoral program is how one student, not as good through the academic part of it, but when it came to that creative part of it, she really took off. And she really ended up doing a very interesting and robust and meaningful study, whereas this Korean student who had done so well academically in her coursework, it was a very painful and slow and difficult process in which every step of the way, she just kept looking for me to tell her what to do. And so this is actually one of the global kind of critiques of the Korean educational system. From the outside world, we look like we have in Korea, we have very high rates of literacy. Our test scores, our PISA math scores, which is an international comparison of different kinds of outcomes. We do very well up there with Singapore and Taiwan and Japan. But in the United States, we have high dropout rates. We have all these issues in K through 12 education. And yet, we're still the leading country in the knowledge economy. And it has a lot to do with cultivating the creativity of the individual. But in this kind of parenting style, the authoritarian parenting style, it's very difficult for individuality to be really cultivated. And therefore, creativity itself comes from a place of confidence and expression of oneself. But more importantly, what happens with authoritarian parenting style is that the child grows up with a very vulnerable sense of self. That's ultimately what it is. That sense of self is always vulnerable. And it becomes a core part of who they are. They struggle constantly with sense of inadequacy, of not being good enough. So another case example, I have a really good colleague friend who teaches at one of the Ivy League schools in the East Coast. And we met at our first academic job at the Claremont Colleges where I started teaching at Pomona College. Her pedigree was amazing. She had a Harvard undergrad degree and a PhD from Yale in English. And on top of that, she was an accomplished pianist. Her father was a doctor, grew up on the East Coast, was really, really now we call them tiger moms. Well, he was a dragon dad. That's what we call the dads, okay? Extreme kind of authoritarian elitist from Korea. So it was interesting because we started our careers together. But, we were planning some kind of a field trip for our classes, but she was having such a hard time. Just planning anything, everything was so difficult and so anxious. It was just tiring to be with her because she was so wrought with uncertainty. And I thought, what an amazing person to be so overwhelmed. So much of her energy dealing with her own sense of, oh, I don't know if I did this right. Should I do this right? So much of that spinning. Not that every single one of people who are grown up with authoritarian parenting, but again, these are kind of some of the outcomes of children growing up with authoritarian parenting. The other common issue that I see with students who then come from this kind of a very strict background, and it's really interesting. We just got a dog for the first time. And I was walking my dog in the back. We have a great lawn in the back of the complex where I live. And there's this young woman who lives just off campus who's Asian American who's been coming at the same time. And she has 2 small dogs. And so they just kind of play a little bit together. And then after a while, we kept running into each other. So we started to talk. And she was saying, oh, you know, she's barely 20, but she's about to graduate. And she was saying, oh, I'm really stressed right now because I don't know if I should apply to law school or if I should apply to seminary. And so I knew that she was a person of faith, and this is, career choice and career development of young adults was my dissertation topic. So I said, I'd be glad to just grab some coffee with you and give you some advice and guidance as a Christian. So we met earlier this week. Oh my goodness. I thought we were meeting to talk about career dilemma and where to go. She says, oh, I just found out something really big. And then she kind of hemmed and hawed, and I didn't want to push her. And we talked more about career and things like that. She says she grew up in a very, very conservative Lutheran church background. And she kept saying very, very conservative. And I know what that's like. And I could sense that it would be very similar too. And her parents were very devout, but very conservative. She kept saying that. But then she was talking about how her freshman year, she partied a lot. I thought, very conservative background, but partying a lot. Okay. And so she was talking about kind of the ways in which she was trying to find her identity and her place in different Christian communities that she tried to connect with. But then she finally confessed and she said, I just found out that I'm pregnant. A 20-year-old woman, very bright. But she said, I've been in relationship with this guy who's not even a Christian. They just, and I just thought, oh my goodness. And she was really, really struggling with what to do. And all of that conservative, traditional, and she herself described it as being very rigid. It was just very hard for her to reconcile what to do, given that kind of background, but the impact that it would have. And so I took her up to my place, we prayed together, I just encouraged her, and all I did was to say that God's grace is big enough for whatever you decide you must do. That God's love and grace is able to cover you and sustain you, no matter what decision you make in this process. But she reminds me a lot of people that I've seen at Adventist colleges who grew up in very conservative backgrounds. And then once they find themselves in a place of freedom, they literally go off-roading. And the reason why, and this is why, again, being super strict and controlling is not good, is, it's like putting a child in a cast. When is that good and when is it not good? And what happens when you take the cast off, regardless? When is it appropriate to put a child or any part of a child in a cast? When they've been hurt and wounded, and it's to stabilize them, to protect them so they can grow. Well, a lot of parents, overprotective parents, take that same idea and think, well, before they break anything, you see that mentality? Before they break an arm or a leg or a limb, let me put the entire child in a cast. Exactly. But so many of our parents kind of had that approach to parenting out of the best intent and love. But what happens then when a child goes off to college and invariably the cast has to come off because the parent is not there? Literally, the parent is the cast holding that child together. What happens? What happens to even a leg when you pull it out of a cast? It shrivels up, it loses its muscle tone. It doesn't have the strength to be able to, right? And so it's through exercise, it's through movement, it's through doing a lot of things that the muscle grows and becomes strong. Well, that's exactly what happens with these kids. Is that once they go to these environments, they haven't tested any boundaries. Everything has been externally imposed, and once those external constraints are removed, they actually don't know how to regulate themselves and make good choices for themselves because all these choices have been made for them and imposed on them. But here's the thing with authoritarianism. We often focus on Ephesians and the authoritarian parents themselves would say children should obey their parents. But they conveniently leave out or stop short of this next part, which is fathers, do not exasperate your children. Because what I see with true extreme authoritarian parenting is that it actually leads their children to lie, to steal, to go behind, because they are so unreasonable in the expectations and the standards that are being imposed on them. So for example, I was called in as a consultant by the dean of students at the Southern California College of Optometry. It's in Fullerton. It's a very competitive school. Almost half of the students are Asian American, and most of those are Korean American women. And there was this one case of a Korean student who was a senior who was about to graduate, where they discovered in her last quarter that she had actually forged the signature for some of her clinical hours that was required. And because it was so late, that they wanted to make sure that they were taking into account all consideration before they made a judgment in her case. And so I was brought in and I was talking with her. And what was really unfortunate but very common again, because one of the most, actually LA Times came and did an article and interviewed me on this, and this was a number of years ago. But in cases of academic cheating and plagiarism, actually Korean Americans in particular were it was very common, especially among Korean Americans. This was about 10 years ago in a slightly different kind of immigration context. But part of that is that for this young woman, she had a very strict authoritarian father he basically belittled her and criticized her and made her feel very small for not getting into medical school. But at the same time, every weekend, they had a family business, some kind of a juice business, and it was expected that she was punitive of the daughter for not living up to his standards and expectations, but at the same time was not warm and supportive, and so she was caught between not wanting to disappoint her parents, but at the same time being very much demanded to help out with the family business. And so she ended up, out of desperation, not to condone her behavior, but this was a classic example and case of the unreasonableness, parents exasperating their children and actually leading them to sin. So, let me move on now to the permissive parents. So you can imagine that permissive parents are the opposite. But there's two different types of permissive parents. How would you differentiate between the two different warmth? And they're called the indulgent permissive parents. I call them grandparent parenting. There's a Korean saying that, a grandchild can hold a 할아버지's 상투, that bun on the hair that no one is supposed to touch. That grandparents can be so indulgent as so that they let their grandchildren move that around, right? So it's with a lot of love. It's like, oh, you want to, okay, do whatever you want. What's the other kind? Do whatever you want because you don't care. Or in some cases, in the case of immigrants, many of us grew up with permissive, neglecting parents. Many of us did. We were latchkey kids. Good thing they didn't have social services and reporting, because we would all be taken into, if not us, our parents would have been, because we all grew up by ourselves. We were lucky if we had grandparents, but most of our parents were working 2 different jobs and we raised ourselves, right? And so this is one of the critiques that I've made of this model, is that many Asian immigrant parents could be classified as both, in a very contradictory way, both as being highly authoritarian, at the same time being permissive, neglecting. Because they were too busy trying to make a living and provide for us. Not necessarily because they didn't care for us, but nevertheless, the actual consequence and the reality of our growing up experience was that of a permissive, neglecting kind of a parent. Right. So, it's the opposite of authoritarian, giving children too much freedom, parents exercising minimal authority. And what happens when a car goes all over the road? It crashes into other cars. And you know exactly what I mean. If there's a permissive child in the church, or in your school setting, or in your friendship setting, you know that that child is all over the place. And they unfortunately learn by bumping into, because the parents have not drawn boundaries to let them know what is appropriate or not. Right? What are some of the reasons for permissive parenting? Why are some of us permissive? Actually, what I observe in this generation, and I can say this because I don't know you, and I can go to different churches and say that because I don't know them without any kind of judgment, but I think there's actually a lot more. Permissive parents don't think they're permissive. I'm serious. And I say this in workshops, and then they all turn to each other, am I permissive? And then they go, oh no, you are permissive. Permissive parents don't usually think that they are. But I think there's an epidemic of permissive parenting in our generation. I really do. I think we really overly indulge our children. We smother them with love, and that's great, but there's a difference between smothering them with love and wanting the best for them, but really not providing enough structure and guidance and accountability. You know who scares me the most? As those children grow up in the church, I see them, because if they're doing something out of line, and it isn't just them, but they're harming other kids. I've been at camp meeting where this kid was acting out, and out of concern for him as well as for other kids, and I remember it was a 4-year-old boy, and I remember trying to just gently kind of constrain him, and he looked at me with the most scary look of defiance, and it was like, who are you? I mean, he didn't say it, but that was the look. And I thought, wow, this is scary. And he knew how to manipulate. So then you know what he started to do? He started to yell really loudly. And then I got scared. Because I thought, oh no, these other people are going to think that somehow I'm trying to abuse this kid. This kid already knew how to manipulate adults. And I thought, oh no, this is not going to work. So I said, I'm going to go and I'm going to take you to your dad. And that was a very difficult, whatever 50 yards it was to find his dad. But once I got to the dad, I realized, not going to do much good, interestingly enough. Interestingly enough, I've been very curious about this kid. And this kid is now grown up to be a college-age student. And I happened to visit a church, and I realized, it's that family. And how do you think those kids turn out? Now, this was a bit of an extreme version, okay? So not all kids who are raised permissively, but this was an extreme version. Do you know that kid doesn't want to have anything to do with his dad? He basically left home, is what I heard. He left home in disgust. He left home in anger, especially towards his dad. But the mom's very nice, but she's also very permissive and just kind of checked out in many ways. And I don't judge her. That's part of her personality. They're both in many ways just part of, in the dad's case, someone kind of alluded to things and I pieced together. The mother of the dad, so the grandmother, was extremely authoritarian. Extremely. And that's part of the reason why many of permissive parents of our generation is because they grew up with authoritarian parents. And they don't want to be those kinds of parents where they suffered under. So again, I went to East Coast somewhere and I did a seminar and I was talking about this, and it happened to be a person that I grew up with, and she said, oh my goodness, I'm a permissive parent. And then she just realized I'm that way because she realized her parents were so strict. But what is it about, I'm going to skip to what is it about permissive parenting? So the kids actually, you think, if they are allowed to do whatever they want, they would be happy. But what's really interesting about these kids is that they're very unhappy. Why would they be unhappy? Why do you think? Whether they're young, and as they get older, they get more and more angry. And then they start to act out. And when they start to act out, how do the parents react? Some of these parents that I really feel for these parents because they've given up on their kids already, and their kids are 5, 6, 7 years old. And they feel like, I don't feel like I can control or constrain this kid anymore. I don't feel that I can. So they're already like, 손 들었어요. Give up. And I genuinely struggle and really empathize with these parents because they genuinely feel like they've done their best. They don't know what else to do. But these kids are acting out more and more, and they get more and more angry. So why are they so unhappy, and why are they so angry at their parents? When they're younger, it's more about being unhappy. Why? Have you been in a public place where you see a kid being petulant? Right? They're complaining, and what do parents do? There's a good Korean word that doesn't exist in English, 달래. It's like, And what do? We try also cajoling, we try bribing, we try reasoning with them. But oftentimes with these kids, does it work? No, they just get more and more petulant and worked up, and I just feel like, you know what? You should not be bribing your children. You should not be cajoling your children. You've already lost that parental authority. But it is not something that is to give up. It's really a mindset for parents to really understand their role and to really own their parental authority. So what we see with authoritarian and permissive parenting is the extremes. One is abusing their parental authority for what means? They're using their parental authority for what? Ultimately to satisfy their own needs and wants, actually. If we had time to look at the biblical example of Saul and David, when Saul is willing to sacrifice David for breaking a rash oath that he made, that no one will eat anything while fighting the Philistines. And then Jonathan, not knowing, eats, and at the end of the day, it comes down to Saul and David. And everyone knows that Saul has made a rash oath for his honor, for his glory, because he says, I will avenge myself of mine enemies, after having done nothing, sitting there and waiting. And Jonathan gets too tired of waiting, so he goes off and starts the war, and it ends up being victorious. But at the end of the day, Saul is willing to sacrifice Jonathan to maintain his honor, his chemen, his glory. Abuse of parental authority, but here with permissive, giving up on their parental authority. Right? So these kids are never happy because it's always they want something more, honestly. It's like kids who get everything, they never appreciate it, they're never really happy with it. They always want more, more, more. They always want what they don't have. But where does the anger come from? Where does the anger come from? And sometimes it's very, very deep, and that's what I saw in this kid who is now a college student, is that he doesn't want to have anything to do with his parent. He feels like you are not good parents at some level. Even though kids challenge the parents, they want parents to be parents. That's how kids experience love and security, through boundaries. And if parents do not enforce that sense of boundary, it actually gives the kids a fundamental sense of insecurity. It's kind of like when I had my first child, and what do? We put them in the middle of the crib, new parents. I don't know if it's your first child or not, but we usually put them in the middle of a crib, infants. Where do they end up? They don't stay in the middle of a crib. Where do they end up? They wiggle and squirm in some way until they go up against an edge. They feel the security of that edge. We need to know where our boundaries are. At some fundamental level, that's how we feel secure, and that's how we feel loved, that someone cares enough about us to create that boundary. So children from neglected families have the poorest emotional, psychological, social, and academic outcomes. So not of surprise there. But here's the other interesting thing. I've already alluded to this, but Asian American immigrant parents are simultaneously and paradoxically both authoritarian and permissive. Okay? In what other ways, in what domains are they both authoritarian and permissive? Because I think this describes a vast majority of immigrant parents. In some ways, they're overly authoritarian. In some ways, they're extremely permissive. They're a quiet bunch. In what ways are they? So think about the domains. In what area are they super strict? Around school and grades, right? All A's or just high level of expectation. Have you thought about why? I mean, beyond the obvious, of course, parents want kids to do well, but why? And in what areas are parents extremely permissive, letting the kids do whatever they want? Like, think about some of you in high school and what you were allowed to do. How was it that you got away with doing things that you know your parents wouldn't if they knew about it, but how was it that you were able to do it? A lot of immigrant parents, they didn't grow up here, so they don't know. They don't know the social scene. They don't know the high school scene. They don't know how to navigate that. So they this is the Korean system, they overly rely on what? Grades. Because in Korea, if you got good grades, it meant that you were also a good student, and what also meant that you were a good kid and you were staying out of trouble because you had to study hard to get the good grades. And so that was an assumption that could be sustained. What they don't know is that in America, you can be a good student and still be really doing all sorts of other things. They don't know that. And they don't even know what are the potential pitfalls. And so a lot of immigrant parents, again, that we grew up with, they were simultaneously very authoritarian when it was coming to schoolwork, but also very permissive when it became to social arena. That kind of complexity and confusion. Okay. So finally, we get to the authoritative parenting. So in contrast to what not to be, we can see that the authoritative parent is one in which they have what? High expectations. There's nothing wrong with high expectations. In fact, one of the biggest problems with urban, low-income, inner-city schools is that the teachers themselves have given up on the kids and they don't have any high expectations. There's nothing wrong. If parents do not want good things from and for their children, if parents don't hold up the high standards and expectations, who will? But what's different from the authoritative parent who has high standards and expectations from the authoritarian parent is what? With warmth and support. With a lot of warmth and support. It's not just like, do this, figure out how to do it, but it's like, do this and let me come alongside and help you and support you. It's also reasonable in an age-appropriate manner. So it's not outrageous, unreasonable standards and expectations, but it is regulated to what is appropriate to that child. Okay? These kinds of parents consistently produce the most positive outcome in kids, including academic, social, emotional, levels of morality, creativity, staying out of trouble. All of the above is associated with this type of parenting style. Right. I'm going to, because of time, I'm going to move ahead to how does this relate to motivating our children? Because as I did these seminars, And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. But as I was doing these seminars, consistently the parents would ask, so how can I effectively motivate my kids? I want my kids to do well. I want my kids to be successful. I just want them to do their best, right? I think most parents are much more reasonable, and it's like, I just want to see them be motivated. So what I did was look at the research that took this basic principles of parenting, the different types of parenting style, and applied it specifically to how can you motivate your children in the most effective manner. Right? So I'm going to quickly go through this. One is that it's okay to have high expectations. But here's the thing. The standards have to be reasonable. So if you have a kid that's standing here, and you tell the kid you have to jump and touch the roof, that's an unreasonable, exasperating standard. And the kid looks up and says, I can't reach that. Well, how will that? And so what is the parent's intent in doing that? Setting a standard that's way above what they know the child can do. What is the parent's intent? Even if they know the child can't reach it, they're hoping, well, we don't want our child to settle. If they just try, then we know that they're not going to reach the roof, but at least they'll strive higher, right? So they think of it as an effective motivational strategy of setting really, really high goals for their children. But in reality, that backfires, because when a child looks at that goal and knows that they can't attain it in that moment, how is that going to affect that child's motivation? They're not going to attempt it. They're not going to attempt it. So setting high, unreasonable goals, even as an aspiration, is not the best way to motivate the child in the moment. So when my boys were young, and I would take them, to the park and such, and there's this one thing they would love to do. If they saw a tree with a low-hanging branch, they would like to jump up and try to hit it. Okay? So what's interesting was they wouldn't attempt to jump if the branch was too high. They wouldn't attempt a branch if it was too low. The ones that they would try the hardest for would be which ones? Just out of reach. They had to work and stretch, but it was like, oh, maybe I can do that. That's how we need to set the goals. Okay? You can say, ultimately, we want to be able to reach this high aspiration, but to a kid, that they're not going to really able to understand that. They're just going to be overwhelmed by looking up at that. But what you want to do is set progressive goals that are just outside of the child's reach. That's when they will stretch, thinking, oh, I think I can do this. And along with it then, and also involve the child in setting their own standard. Kids have a very strong, well-developed innate sense of justice and fairness. So they're actually pretty good about regulating that. So involve them. Have the conversation with them in an age-appropriate manner, right? And then when they attempt it, provide lots of encouragement and support. So the traditional authoritarian parenting style prescribed by Confucius is never compliment. There's a Confucian saying, I think the Korean adults may, only a fool compliments his wife and his kid, right? So that's what they did. They never complimented their kid except in front of other people, so they violated that. Okay? We overly tend to focus on failure, and we minimize success. We need to flip that. We need to recognize success and to minimize failure, but not to the point of encouragement. So both of my boys, I have one is a college senior and one's a high school senior. And by the way, they came and played at a golf tournament here and won. Do you remember that? Yes? They were asking when the next golf tournament was, by the way. But when they were young, I would take them out to the driving range. And what was so interesting was I would often take my work and I would sit in the back and then they would be, hitting balls in the driving range. And every time they shot a really good shot, they would always look back to make sure. So it's interesting how even as grown adults, I still want my parents' approval. I really do. If something wonderful happens to me, if I'm going somewhere, or even if I come to Loma Linda to do a seminar, I'm always telling my dad, Dad, I'm going to go to Loma Linda and to do a seminar. She goes, oh, I'm going to go. Oh, that's great. Of course, they would hit some really bad shanks, and then they would be like looking back at me as well. And what I would do is immediately look down and pretend that I wasn't looking. Yeah, small things, but again, Asian parents tend to be overly focused on the failure and overly try to correct weaknesses and undermine the strengths. And it is far more effective to really develop the strengths rather than trying to build up the negative, as long as it is not a really extreme liability. Right? I think there's like a time delay. Where? Okay. Yes, so here's one of the research. What they found, problems to solve, and what they saw was that with authoritative parents, they offered more encouragement and support, but they also offered very tangible, concrete support. So it wasn't just like, do this, and you figure it out, but that they would provide the warmth and support, but come alongside their kids, not do the work for them, but to come alongside the kids and provide what we call scaffolding to help build them. Right? So that's one of the big things that we see in terms of research. On the other hand, what we see is, why is helicopter parenting so bad? You hear this a lot. And now we also hear of lawnmower parents. Do you actually know where the helicopter? So a lot of this came from the Silicon Valley area, where you had mothers who were themselves very successful professionals and highly educated, who for various reasons chose to stay home. And so because they were so driven themselves, they channeled a lot of that into the children. And so that they would hover over the children to kind of, make sure that everything went well and that they wouldn't. But after a while, these helicopter parents became lawnmower parents, because they would go, for example, some parents would call ahead to the school and say, can you not say something to my kid because it might hurt his or her feelings? And within most schools, they have this kind of, most teachers and school systems I see have this reaction towards parents. And we're seeing this even in higher education as well. One time I was sitting in my office, and then I get this call from a Korean parent from the East Coast. And I thought, how did this person, she was resourceful enough to track me down. And then she goes, my son is a freshman there. And I don't know if he's getting to school on time. I kept calling him, but he doesn't answer the phone. So can you go over there and make sure, check in on him to make sure that he's waking up to go to school? I thought, wow, I've never gotten that kind of call since then or before. But what is it about hovering? What message, or if you, in your anxiousness for your child to perform at a certain level, and for your fear of failure that somehow them getting a C or even a D on a homework, we overly catastrophize. Like if he does, then they won't get into this school, and then this and this and that. It's like that, what is that commercial that if you didn't do this and you end up in some catastrophe? I think it was DirecTV ad that kind of made fun of this at one point in time. But what happens when we hover? What is the message? Or we overly do the homework for our kids? What is the message we convey to them? I don't believe what? That you can do it. That's the message that we are conveying. I don't have confidence that you can do it. And so I'm going to do it for you. And or the outcome is so important that I have to ensure the outcome for you. And what this has created is a generation of kids that are really struggling with anxiety and depression. And it's literally an epidemic in higher education. And we see it the most in high-achieving kids who go to schools like USC and UCLA, being the primary basis of their identity. so they don't actually struggle with it as much. But the kids in these very competitive schools are the ones who, when on paper, they're absolutely amazing. I talk to some of them. I host things in my home. I take them on field trips and to the museum and Walt Disney Concert Center. I get to talk to them, and I think, wow, how does someone do that much before they come to college? But it's these very kids then who, with social comparison, are so consumed with anxiety and depression about not keeping up, about not being able to do what is expected of them. Last year at USC, we hired 10 full-time new additional mental health counselors. The Chronicle of Higher Education on its cover a year or so ago had this picture of a student sitting at a desk and literally this tidal wave about to swamp over them. This is our biggest struggle in higher education right now. It is not how can we provide the best education for our kids. It's really how do we manage the mental health crisis that we see in the smartest and the brightest kids of our generation. There's a lot of factors that go into it. Helicopter parenting, I think, certainly played a role. Social media, I think, definitely plays a role for themselves. And then I really feel that there is a satanic force at work. I really, really do. That our young generation is besieged and attacked from within and without in ways that are truly, truly very scary. Very, very scary. Our youth need our prayers more than ever before. Ever before. All right, I will wrap up here. So we talked about praising success and minimizing failure. The other thing that I'm sure that if you've been around in education circles, you hear a lot about growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And what that is that rather than emphasizing outcome, so most of our parents, it was about emphasizing the outcome, like getting that A or getting into this. So emphasizing the outcome isn't the most effective way of motivating our children. What we really need to do is inspire them to persist. So emphasizing persistence and effort is like having renewable hybrid energy versus trying to turn your child into like a Ferrari or a Porsche. Those things require high octane energy, and it runs out pretty quick. And so we see ourselves as constantly having to fill high octane energy if we imagine ourselves or see our kids as high performance sports cars. But if we think about hybrid approach, that's where emphasizing effort really becomes a self-sustaining and self-renewing energy. And so if anything, we need to emphasize effort. Here's a couple of other things that I want to very quickly. How about use of rewards? Especially with young children, rewards are very effective. What about compliments? There's a better way to compliment kids, and there are ways that actually it doesn't help. How do we tend to compliment kids? So if a kid brings you a color drawing thing and shows you, and it's really not that good, what do we tend to do? Oh, we make flowery kinds of compliments, a very general one. That doesn't help them at all. It really doesn't. That's also feeding into this false, especially with the certificates and everyone must get an award kind of mentality. You know, I have students now who are graduate students, and I, give them feedback on writing. I spend tremendous amount of time giving feedback on writing, and then they come and challenge me and say, everybody else gave me A's. I don't know why you have a problem with my writing. I think, wow, this is part of the generation that we've come to. So they just false feeding of their egos. So these kind of global compliments are not good, especially if it's not warranted. So if a child brings you some coloring thing and it's really not that good, but you still want to encourage them, and you want to encourage them to do better. So one example would be to pick something in what they've done that is praiseworthy. So I might say, oh, I really like how you colored within the lines here. I really like the way that you use different colors in this way. Pick something specific that is praiseworthy and compliment them very specifically. So that's a far more effective use of rewards than these kind of generalized, oh, you're so good at coloring. And certainly not praise them for things that they didn't actually do. Like, for example, praising kids for being, oh, you're so cute. You know, praise them for effort, something that they have earned, right? What about use of punishment? Is there ever a place for punishment? Yes, there is. But it should be used in a very specific way. Using punishment to get them to do what you want them to do is not as effective, because punishment is best to tell them what not to do. It doesn't necessarily help. It's not the most effective way of trying to get them to do certain kinds of desired behavior, but punishment should be used to extinguish undesirable behavior. But it needs to be done in a very specific way. One, apply as immediately as possible. And the younger they are, the closer the time association, so that they really understand the cause and effect relationship between what they did and the punishment. Secondarily, make sure that it is not in anger. If you can't control your anger in punishing a child, then wait until as soon as you can. What is it? So imagine yourself as a kid, and you're punishing the child, and the child does deserve the punishment for whatever it is, but you're a kid, and the parent or the adult is angry, is towering over you. What is that kid going to be focusing on in that moment? What's going through their mind? Are they thinking about the bad thing that they did? No. They're going to be thinking about, how do I get out of this situation as quickly as possible? What can I say and do to get out of this? But more so than that, all they're reacting to is the emotional charge of the parent. So basically, the child, rather than reflecting and thinking about what the behavior was, self-reflecting, they're overwhelmed with your emotion and of fear, and all they're focusing on is, mom and dad are angry at me. Then whatever was the legitimate use of the punishment gets completely neutralized. So there is a role and time and place for punishment, but it should be used very judiciously and in very particular ways. There's a lot in here that I kind of glossed over, or we don't really have time to get into, but I want to end with this. I think it is and that is, at the end of the day, what I see, even in this age, is that our children want to be inspired. It may seem like a very kind of a pie in the sky kind of thing, but actually I see the power of being inspired. Our children, even when they're focused on things that are self-interest, there's something about something lofty and something that is bigger, that when they see that, it draws something out of them. And so that's what I would say, parents, is not to be focused on outcome, but really out of a genuine, this generation especially, they're not particularly interested in material things. They're not motivated by the same kinds of values that our parents had or that our generation may share. I have one niece right now who's out in Thailand saving elephants. And after that, she's going to go to China to save dogs from being food. And she's already done this like several times a year. Now she works, but she works in some creative industry. She makes good income. And so I was talking with their parents, and we were saying, boy, but this is the generation. She's in her late 30s, going into 40s. She has a good, stable job, but every time, every opportunity she has, she spends her vacation time going to save animals. This is the generation that is driven by values and by meaning, and less about the kind of material security that were so important to us. So now more than ever before, they're really attuned to authenticity and integrity. And so if we just try to impose certain outcomes that we want, it really will not inspire our children. And this is why, rather than acting as Christians, if we really, really embrace our calling as parents, that if ultimately we are trainers. Do you know that we're trainers? Train up your children in the way that they should go, and when they grow up, they will not depart from it. I like to see us as gardeners, that we are actually gardeners in the vineyard of God, and our children are not our possessions. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that our parents' generation, that within Asian culture, children are seen in an interdependent way as an extension of the parents. That is the interdependent, collectivistic Asian culture. So that's why the parents felt like they had so much right to be able to dictate and to influence what careers they went into, who they should marry, because it was a direct reflection back on the parents. So there are ways in which the Asian culture really emphasizes that, but perhaps too much. And so that we see our children in many ways not only as an extension of ourselves, as a reflection of ourselves, but in some ways as our possession to do as we wish. And as a psychologist working with college student population, I see the harm and the pain that it does to our young children when parents impose this kind of value. And what I wish that we would do is to really be good caretakers and gardeners of our children. Just because they are our children, we don't know what kind of a fruit tree they will be. Watch them grow. See what kind of leaves they develop. And then depending on what kind of tree they are, provide different kind of nurturing. Some trees need more pruning, and some fruit trees need more of certain kind of nutrient. Some fruit trees need more shelter and shade. Some need a lot of sun. That's our job as parents, to be good students and stewards of our children. Not to impose, you have to be an avocado tree because avocados fetch a lot of money. That's what we tend to do. Rather, we need to carefully nurture and study our children to see what kind of a fruit tree are they, and then enable them to bear the best kind of fruit. So what is the fruit that our children are to bear, that we ourselves are to bear? Ultimately, what is all this good parenting? Yes, we want them to be successful. Yes, we want them to be secure. Yes, we want them to be happy. But in the ultimate biblical sense, what is it that we should aspire to and want for our children? What is it that God expects of us and ultimately God expects of our children? What is that fruit? It's a very simple concept. And once you realize the simplicity of the concept, it makes parenting actually a lot easier. Every time I go anywhere, one time I was going to New York. This was early in my career. And I was going to New York invited by this very, very rich Korean venture capitalist. He actually named a wing of the Asian Museum of Art in San Francisco. If you go there, you'll see his name inscribed on the side. Back about 20 years ago, he paid $25 million for that wing. He was very successful, but his family life, as he would describe it, was in shambles. He had been married twice, and by that time, he was already fairly old. His children didn't want to have anything to do with him. They had mostly married non-Koreans, and so he, after achieving so much financial success in America, he just felt that it was all empty and that it was kind of meaningless. So he sponsored this conference on Korean immigrant family. And because of my expertise in it, I was invited by him to be a keynote speaker. And so I was flying out to New York, and this was one of my first kind of career kind of accomplishments. And of course, I stopped by my parents, and they still live in the same place in Anaheim. And I was telling my dad, and my dad, I don't know if you know my dad, he's very warm and affectionate. And he goes, oh, my daughter, you know. Says all that, but as I'm about to leave, he goes, do not forget that you are to be a blessing to others. That simple idea is the most powerful and profound truth that should guide who we are and what we say to our children. That's what I tell my kids. Your primary job on this earth is to be a blessing. In whatever way, wherever you go, you are to be a blessing. That is the fruit that we are to bear. And I say, what are the particular ways and talents and abilities and experiences that God has given you, that you have had, that will allow you to be of greatest blessing? If my parents forced me to become an avocado tree like everyone else, I wouldn't be standing here before you. I'm a very unique path and profile among my peers. Every single one of my peers went to Loma Linda. Do you know how scary and lonely it was when I was going through PUC as a psychology major? And my dad was the pastor of the Loma Linda church at that time. So I would come back home during breaks, and then, all the Arundar would say, oh, what are you studying? They're always curious, right? And then I would be like, 네, 저 심리학 공부해요. Which means I'm studying psychology. And they would go, oh, 그래. Even before I finished saying it, they were already turned away and basically thinking, you poor lost kid, you should be a nurse and marry a nice doctor, and then you'd be set for life. It was really hard. It was really hard. But somehow God gave me the passion and the concern and the commitment and the interest in people, in the immigrant experience, and how do we understand that? How can I help other immigrant communities deal with the kinds of issues that I saw within the early Korean immigrant community? I went to grad school, and then I started doing research on it, and lo and behold, there was a room and place for it, and I ended up here because I was trying to do the best that I can with where I felt that God was leading me. And then I just ended up. Now my dad is like, oh, my golden daughter. But it isn't because of that. I'm glad that they are proud. But what I'm saying is, if you really, really support and encourage your children to be a blessing, but in ways that they are particularly and uniquely equipped to do, that is our role. That is what will make them happy. That is what will make you happy. And that's where my dad says, you know what, you bring us so much honor. Not because I tried to do that, but by being faithful to God, we bring honor to everyone. And so, in the short time that we have, I know I've kept you much longer than I wanted to or intended, but again, the resources will be made available to you, but if you just hold on to that idea, let that guide you. And then some of this information about the different types of parenting and the concrete strategies for motivating can all help navigate the specific challenges of being parents in this day and age. But more than ever, our children need our prayers. They really, really do. Earnest, sincere prayers. This is a scary world. It really, really is. And Satan has really honed the crafts of his temptation. And he is closing in on our children. Before it used to be from the outside, it's now from the inside out. And it really, really is the time that not only as parents, but as a church, that we come together and we really, really love our children, provide structure and guidance, anchor them in their identity of who they are as children of God, and set them and provide that as a secure foundation for them to be able to navigate this very difficult world. So I thank you for being here. So I'm going to close us with prayer. Yeah. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much. You are an amazing Heavenly Father, and you look down upon all of us here, and I know that your Heavenly Father's heart aches so much more so than when we ache for our own children, Father. You want so much for us, Father. Most of all, you want to be in relationship with us, because that, knowing you, surrendering to you, obeying you, and being guided by you, and putting you first and foremost in our lives will bring all the other blessings in its train, as Mrs. White has said. So Heavenly Father, help us truly to put you first, seek your kingdom first, that all these other things will come in its place. I ask for an extra measure of your Holy Spirit to be poured out upon each and every one of the parents, and that you would guide them and lead them to be the best parents that they can, to be able to instill in their precious children a knowledge, an experiential knowledge of you, and that we can support our children to bear fruit, to simply be a blessing wherever they are. Thank you for your love and for your Son, Jesus. Amen.